Hi, it's Rick Prescott here talking about my book, Save the Beatles, subtitled The Rescued Albums, 1970 to 1982. Book's available at Amazon or at SaveTheBeatles.com, Barnes & Noble, any other place, Goodreads, any other place that you can think of that you might want to buy a book, you can buy this. It's also available for Kindle. And one of the things I want to talk about here is the subtitle is The Rescued Albums, but I ended up though I started out with the idea that I was going to rescue Beatles albums from the solo tracks of the 70s, it ended up that I started thinking of that more as fusing the solo tracks together into group albums. And I want to talk about that process because it's much more than, as many people have done, is just listening and picking out your favorite tracks and putting them together onto the same mixtape or something like that. Those are great. I have no objection to that. Everybody should do that. Listen to those however you want. My idea was, though, to do something a little more methodical and try and actually see if I could capture something of who the Beatles might have been in the 70s. I think that was captured. And part of it is because of the fusion process. And I talked a little bit in the book about the three phases of the Beatles' career. Typically we talk about the early, middle, and late years of the Beatles. The early years being kind of everything from Please Please Me up to Help, and then Rubber Soul to Sgt. Pepper as the middle years, and the White Album through Let It Be as the late years. We kind of think of those. And I think of the periods differently. I think of the periods as the earliest years that the Beatles had. They were what I call fraternal showmakers, and I give much more information about this. But the core of the idea is that from their very earliest incarnation, the Beatles were about putting on a show. And they were great at putting on a show. They had an audience, they were on a stage, they were in a club, they were playing their instruments and singing songs with the idea of entertaining a crowd that was sitting right in front of them. The songs that they played were the songs that they loved, which is to say not originals. They were almost exclusively covers. There were a couple of originals that squeaked in that early period. But they were showmakers in the sense that they were taking popular music, playing it for their friends, creating shows, and being entertaining in that way. The word fraternal is stuck on there because it was during this early period that they actually sort of bonded. And by bonding, I really mean John, Paul, and George. And Stu to a degree, but never Pete Best. Of course, Stu did not survive to see the second phase, and Pete Best was jettisoned primarily because they didn't have a bond with him. And they did have the bond with Ringo, despite the fact that he was in a different band. So in one way, it helps explain why they made that little change. Not that we don't understand that, but it helps underscore that. But the fraternal showmaker phase was from the very beginning when John and Paul met and they were a band, the Quarrymen and whatever other incarnations that they were, up until the point that they got their audition with George Martin. So phase one, fraternal showmakers. That's who the Beatles were in that earliest phase. Phase two, tandem performing songwriters. And the big change there is that they went from doing exclusively covers to writing their own tunes. Now, as we know, John and Paul had each written tunes earlier, and Paul may have written a whole batch of tunes earlier, but only selected ones ever made it into those early set lists. But starting at about the time they signed their recording contract, which is the same time that they signed their publishing deal, because they had enough originals to justify the possibility of that, they switched almost entirely from doing covers to doing originals. And it was as if a light bulb had gone off and a door had opened and everything changed. And this is a big, big shift for the group in that though they were still performing, they were still actually standing in front of people on a stage, they were now no longer simply performing the cover versions of songs that everybody knew. They were now introducing new songs. And John and Paul became songwriters in this period. They did all of their trial and error songwriting. It's so wonderful to listen to those early records because they immediately came up with songs that would go on to be classics, of course, but there are some clunkers. And the clunkers are in there as they try out different things. They try out how can we use chords here? How can we use harmonies there? How can we use instruments there? And they try out all sorts of different things. And we hear them learning as they're going through, and they continue to learn. The second phase, therefore, is mostly about continuing to perform, but now they are songwriters instead of just showmakers. Then the fact that they were moving together, in this case in tandem, is an evolution from the idea that they were fraternal. So in fraternal, they were like building these brotherly bonds. And as they moved into songwriting, they continued to move in tandem, and the fraternal bonds which were established continued through. But now there were stresses, and they were pushed in different ways. And though they moved together, the layers started to come in where John and Paul were suddenly elevated over George and Ringo. And it took George time to build himself back in where he was a primary contributor. And Ringo, it took time for people to realize what Ringo's contribution actually was. So though the fraternal bonds were still there, they were now moving in tandem rather than continuing to build that. And of course, they continued to have bond building while they were doing the crazy touring and everything like that. But in terms of their creative work, they're now moving in tandem rather than moving fraternally. So that actually lasts through, let's see, probably through Rubber Soul, in which even on Rubber Soul, the British version of Rubber Soul, you still hear them working out kind of what it means to write songs. And it's during Rubber Soul, it's during the sessions for Rubber Soul that they start to realize that, hey, we can do things with the recording process that we couldn't do before. And this is the point where they diverged from their stage show, and they started creating sounds in the studio that couldn't be duplicated on stage. And at that point, they are no longer just tandem performing songwriters. They rapidly morph into aligned studio auteurs. And I think, I spent a long time trying to figure out exactly how to characterize this change. But this is the point where they realized that their work was being done in the studio and not on the stage. They still had stage obligations, but their focus changed. They no longer were just working for the concerts and the tours and the TV appearances and everything like that. They were now putting all of their creative energy into what was happening in the studio. And that's where I call them auteurs, because in a studio, when you're working in a studio, they had complete control. And that complete control is what an auteur has. They have the ability to say, I am doing whatever I want to do. The songwriting part, believe it or not, despite the fact that they continued to write great songs, the songwriting part fell back just a little bit because they realized that what you could do with studio techniques is you could take a song that wasn't so good and make a great record out of it. Now, there aren't a lot of examples of that, but the one that always comes to mind is What Goes On, which is from Rubber Soul. And What Goes On was a song that they had recorded earlier and rejected because they didn't think it was good enough. And the early recording of What Goes On sounds a lot like other stuff that they did in that period. But when they got to Rubber Soul and they were short one song, they pulled out What Goes On and they said, look, this may not be the greatest song we've ever written, but let's record it with our new technique. And this is where you realize, and where they realized, that what they were doing was making records, and that the techniques of the studio could suddenly make songs that weren't as good sound better. And there are many examples of that now appear, starting with Rubber Soul all the way through the rest of their career, where the studio technique is more important than the songwriting. So I also changed the word from moving in tandem to being aligned. So despite the fact that they were still a group, as they were doing their early tours, they were moving in tandem, all four of them moving together. And starting with about that vacation they took after Revolver, after the bad tour in 1966, they were no longer moving in tandem in that same way. Now they were aligned with each other, and they came together to do things, but they started to go off in separate directions. And this is the point where that became the case. So phase 3, I call the aligned studio auteurs. Now the reason I'm going through this is because this is what makes what happens in the 70s, or what might have happened in the 70s, possible. Because the next phase, the fourth phase, is what I call fused independent artists. And there's only a taste of it in the actual Beatles catalog. So when I say, as I said at the beginning, there are 3 phases. We've talked about those 3 phases. The fourth phase begins to appear during that period, but it never actually flowers in the way that it might have in the 70s. And that is where each is his own recording artist. And they record separately. They are creative individually, but they still come together on album to be bigger than the sum of their parts. Now this did happen to a certain degree, and it started with Yesterday, in which Paul was the only Beatle recording, playing on it. The other examples are examples of them bringing in outside musicians to contribute. They didn't require that all Beatles appear on each track, and they could allow for outside players to come in. So that's a big part of it. And then as the years went on, the White Album, as we know, saw times when Paul was working solo in one studio, or working with Ringo in one studio, and George was working solo in another studio, and he had Eric Clapton with him. John, not as likely to do that, but he did actually have times when he was working on himself. Julia is a perfect example of that. And so we have signs of that. So when they broke up, basically they could have said, look, I don't want to be the session man on your record. This sounds like something George might have said to Paul. I'm not going to be the session man on Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey. Why don't you go make that record? Bring it back. I'll go make my records, bring them back, and we'll find somebody to put them all together and make them into an album. Now that's a function that George Martin had already served for the band, all along to varying degrees. In the book, I feel like, George Martin may not have wanted to do that, because as we know, in 69 and 70, he was kind of done with the Beatles. He had his other business going on, and he was kind of done with them. So he might not have wanted to do that. Plus, I also don't feel like, despite the fact that I try and use techniques and ideas that George Martin would have used, I don't feel like I can credit the assemblies that I created to George Martin. So instead, I created the character of an assembler. The assembler is the guy who takes all of the tapes and puts them in order, puts the tracks in order, decides which track come in and puts them in order. And there's a lot to be said about the assembler. That's just an introduction. I will talk about the assembler in more detail in a further video. But when we talk about the fourth phase, the fused independent artists, what we recognize is that the Beatles broke up at just the point where they became too big for each other. They broke up at just the point where they didn't really want to be session men for each other anymore, and they didn't need to be session men for each other anymore. That was not a requirement. They had already started fusing their independent work together into group projects. And that might have flowered, and that might have been the whole way they operated in the 70s. Everybody could record whenever, wherever, and with whomever, and on a regular basis, they would pool their resources, hand them to an assembler who would say, this is what the Beatles sound like in this year. And that is a critical piece of how this idea works. And understanding sort of those phases and how that fourth phase might have developed is critical before you start putting tracks into putting sequencing tracks into albums, because you need to see that, hey, they were already almost kind of doing this. In the end, they were only doing backing tracks together. Now, of course, for Abbey Road, they did all come together, at least on certain occasions. They came together. But they wouldn't have had to. And that's the point, that once you understand that, the idea of the fusion era, which is the 70s, makes a lot more sense, and it seems actually possible. So I talk in great detail about these and how it can set the stage for the creation of the fourth phase and the creation of the fused albums, or as the subtitle says, the rescued albums. And so once again, Save the Beatles is, you can visit savethebeatles.com, or you can look on Amazon, or Barnes & Noble, or any place, Goodreads, any place that you want to buy books. It is available. My name is Rick Prescott. Thanks very much.